Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We do have a beautiful sunny day in the Pacific Northwest. I hope from wherever you are, you're having a good day as well. My name is Kelly Scardina, and I am a senior advisor working with equity and school systems improvement for particularly for emergent bilinguals and English learners. I work with Education Northwest. I'm a teacher by trade. I have been in education. I was thinking about this is actually starting my 30th year. So a long time. I've seen a lot. I've experienced a lot. Did a lot of elementary work, but also have done quite a bit in the secondary level, as well as curriculum support, and dual language programming is my background. But we are excited today to be here to talk with you about innovations and reimagining learning for what is to come. We know that we've had an opportunity this past we keep saying year, 18 months. I think we're getting closer to 2 years to really think about how we've been delivering education and how we've been engaging students in learning. And I know that there's a lot going on in your state, as well as throughout the US, that has been innovative and exciting and trying, experimental to try to figure out how to best engage students in this new world that we live in. So today we'll be talking a little bit about some ideas and some of the research that I've dug into, and we will have opportunities for us to engage with one another's ideas as well. I am coming to you from Portland, Oregon, and due to the current situation, luckily we are able to engage virtually, so I'm excited about that. I think this is something that we'll lean on throughout this next year as we come in and out of schools, but also just a nice way for us to engage with one another even when we live far. So building state capacity to improve student outcomes. I've actually done this presentation in Montana as well. And so thinking about the educational leaders in Idaho and Montana, the Comp Center is what we're involved in to work to improve student outcomes, close achievement gaps, and increase the quality of instruction. And this is the Region 17 Comprehensive Center helping to engage and support that work in both Idaho and Montana. So during the pandemic, schools have really become places of, as I said, innovation, right? And we've had to really expand our ideas about what and how we meet students' new needs. Maybe they're not new, but we're certainly acknowledging and recognizing that they're new. So we have a lot of opportunities for new learning. We understand that our most impacted students will need some different kinds of supports than we've provided in the past. And so today we'll talk a little bit about that design thinking to challenge our previous assumptions and try to see things with a new lens so that we can be creative in how we address those needs. So our goal today is to explore innovative examples from the field and reimagine ways to design school and learning for all students in this post-pandemic world. So this is a fun piece that I like to share. So it's really often hard for us to think outside of the box, like think outside of what we've been doing for a while, because we've become so ingrained in our own patterns of thinking, and so that we don't have to learn something new every day, right? So especially as teachers and as school staff, we really do rely on these processes, and they're not always conscious, right? So thinking about when we get up in the morning, when we eat, walk, and read, those are all subconscious processes But we also have to relate that to when we assess our challenges at work or in our private lives. So an example or something to think about is some years ago, there was this incident where a truck driver tried to pass under a low bridge, as you can see on the article on the right, the photo on the right. He failed. The truck was lodged firmly underneath that bridge, and that driver was unable to continue driving, or he couldn't go forward and he couldn't go back. So the story goes that as the truck really became stuck, it caused, massive traffic problems, and emergency personnel showed up, engineers, firefighters, truck drivers gathering to try to figure out, some various solutions for dislodging this truck. So the emergency workers were debating whether to take apart the truck, dismantle it, or chip away at parts of the bridge. All of them spoke about a solution which fit within their level of expertise, right? And a little boy walking by saw what was happening, looked at the truck, looked at the bridge, and then looked at the road and said nonchalantly, "Why not just let the air out of the tires?" Right? And so the solution was tested, and the truck was able to drive free with ease, having suffered only the damage caused by its initial attempt to pass underneath that bridge. So this story really does symbolize the struggles that we face, where oftentimes the most obvious solutions are the ones that are hardest to come by because of those self-imposed constraints that we work within. So thinking about that, I do want to take a minute for us to also let people know who is in the room. I failed to do that in the beginning, but I'd like us to start using the chat as a way for us to engage and communicate. So if you could just put in the chat your position and maybe where you work, and anything else pertinent that would be good for the rest of us to know. And if you're driving, don't worry about chatting. You could unmute if you wanted to say something, and we'll just continue on. And those of you that are able to, please do share where you're from and what your role is. Great. So we have State Department representation, superintendent from school district, coordinator for the State Department for rural, effective educator, rural low-income schools, federal programs. Wonderful. It's great to have you all here with us today. Thank you. So that idea about, thinking outside of the box is sometimes hard for us because, as I stated earlier, those patterns that we have of thinking are subconscious. So sometimes it just takes a fresh perspective or a pandemic, for example, to make us think about needing to do things in a different way. So here's another example of design thinking, which is thinking outside of the box and trying to figure out a new way to do things. You may have already seen this before. I'm going to go ahead and share my computer sound and optimize my screen so that we can all, oopsies, here we go back. We can see this video. It's a little fuzzy, but you'll get the gist.
ऊपर से निकलती अच्छा नहीं नीचे नीचे तो ही करना है हाँ अंदर निकल अरे नहीं निकल रहा हट जाओ गड़बड़ नहीं करना नहीं नीचे से कर पटेल यहाँ तो यहाँ बस छोड़ दीजिए ये मैं निकाल दूँ पकड़ ये पकड़ नीचे झुको बैठो नीचे से कराओ काम सही कर पहले कान सही कर रहे भाई ये ऊपर सामने हटा ले पहले कान सही कर हाँ घर में आए जल्दी नको कर तू खैर अरे कहाँ से घुसा नहीं पटेल अंदर मुंडे अंदर मुंडे अंदर निकाल लो अरे हाँ मियाँ अरे कुछ दिमाग में आ रहे निकाल
All right. So that video is a good reminder as well. Doesn't it make you wince though, looking at the way that little boy, he kept trying to push his head through that bar, and every time I watch that, it just makes me wince. It really does. So this design thinking is that nonlinear process that we have to really engage in when we're thinking about doing something differently. And I can't emphasize enough that those patterns that we have, those subconscious patterns that we have developed over time by doing the same things over and over again, or being inside the problem, sometimes you can't see the outside of the problem, really is important to rethink or restructure the way that we think to try to come up with some innovative solutions. So this interaction design foundation starts with that empathize. So thinking about your learners, how are you really digging into what their needs are or what it is that they're experiencing? And then, that helps you to define that problem. So you go to your user's needs, their problem, you can offer your insights, thinking about that little boy and him addressing the truck being stuck. He was able to think about the needs, the truck is stuck, thinking about the problem and had a different insight. Maybe it was because he was closer to the ground and he could see that there was a potential for lowering the truck, or maybe it was just that, he had some sort of experience with air in the tires, but it was quite a creative way to solve the problem, which it really did. And then the idea about ideate by challenging those assumptions and creating ideas for innovative solutions. It is really a hard thing for us to do because we have been doing what we know best for many of us a very long time. So challenging those assumptions and looking for new ideas is something that should be done collaboratively. It should be involving the stakeholders in that process as well. And then coming up with a prototype to start creating solutions, and then getting to that place of testing those solutions. So if you look at this process, this interaction design thinking, that it really is not, starting with empathize and ending with tests. It's something that you go back and forth and around to try out new ideas, see if they work. A lot of us, we can relate this to education and piloting. Sometimes though, when we pilot things, we don't necessarily have those other parts of this process. Maybe we haven't fully defined the problem. Maybe we haven't created a prototype that really does address the problem itself. Maybe it addresses a different problem, but not the problem we're trying to solve necessarily. So just be thinking about ways that you might use this process of design thinking to rethink what we've already been doing. And many of you may be familiar with this model already. This plan, do, study, act model really does enhance the design thinking I know that at least in Montana, this is something that they utilize for their continuous improvement. Maybe it looks familiar to you, but it goes along to support that idea about it's a cycle, and it's not something that you get to the end and you're done, but it's a continual process. So let's talk about school before the pandemic. Well, we know that this the school schedule, we say, was built on the agrarian calendar, but it actually wasn't built on the agrarian calendar, because the idea of crops being ready were, you know, fall and then spring for planting. So summertime wasn't really about releasing families and children to go work in the farms. That isn't necessarily true. What happened was, when people started moving to the cities, that it was just too hot. They didn't have the ability to cool themselves off, and so they did begin to close down schools in the summertime. The other thing to think about before the pandemic is, you know, there was the school schedule had a set start time and a set finish time. The school staff was mainly in-house, you know, and there wasn't a whole lot of opportunities for students to engage in school outside of what was available during the school day with the current staff that was hired to do that. And then we also just had in-person options only, so the structure was real different. Of course, the pandemic really interrupted all of that. Some of that started changing ahead of the pandemic, but the pandemic really solidified our need to look at things differently. And so if we think about, you know, the school calendar, instead of summers off, that we want to provide year-round opportunities. And as I said, lots of schools were doing that before the pandemic. But it is something we really need to be thinking about as we move forward. So a lot of school districts, we were engaged in a lot of work this year, this summer in particular, with schools that were engaging in that year-round opportunity to try to re-engage kids. That school schedule going from a set start and finish to opportunities for extended day learning. So thinking about ways that you might provide opportunities before the start time and after the school day. I know there's a lot of things going on weekends and evenings, virtually and in person. So really to try to engage community organizations with that as well, because I know that our school staff is stretched. So either alternating schedules or altering schedules, or providing opportunities for students and school staff to engage with additional staff. I know that there were a lot of opportunities for that during summertime. With one of the school districts that we were working with in Washington, they provided, or they pulled out some brand new teachers from their teacher education program. They took instructional assistants that had their teaching licenses, and they just did they cast a wide net to try to pull people in, knowing that the classroom teachers were just too tired and they needed a break. So getting creative with ways that you can leverage those community relationships and bring people in to support, and or move kids out, right? So how are we getting kids out into the community and engaging in other learning experiences? And then the school structure. So we mainly did in-person learning, but now we know we can, I'll say that dirty word, pivot, and we have, you know, opportunities for virtual learning, which could be fully online, the flipped classroom, which is an innovation that a lot of people did before the pandemic, but really starting to capitalize on that as well, so that they're learning the content before they come to class. Asynchronous is something that we've all been experiencing, as well as many other ideas. Okay, so who are those students most impacted by the pandemic? And I know it's different for everybody, for your particular populations, but generally speaking, they were the students that were suffering before. And so this is from Fairfax County Public Schools in Virginia. While all school groups had increased failure rates early in the school year, students with disabilities and English learners had the highest rates of Fs compared to white and Black students. So if you could please put into the chat, which students have you had the most difficulty reaching this year with your experience? I know some of you are working with the State Department, but maybe you have an idea about the students that have been most difficult to reach. And then of the kids that came to school this past year and a half, which students were the ones that struggled the most in your region? So if you could share that in the chat, we can continue our conversation. You know that a lot in our state in Oregon is the Native American populations really struggled a lot, as well as our English learner populations. Students with disabilities, that varied. You know, some of them were the first ones to go back in person, and they were the only ones to go back in person, or they had individual class time, you know, a few times a week. The homeless students, the migratory students, yes. It was really hard to track a lot of our students that were deemed migrant, were labeled migrant because they were moving to new places in response to needs and employment needs by their parents and families. So it'll be different. I mean, there'll be some through lines, but it'll be different for everybody. And it's just a reminder that we really have to get to know what are the specific needs of certain populations. And even within those populations, there's going to be varying needs. So we can't just say all English learners will need this, or we can't just say all students with disabilities will need this. So it really is digging in a little bit more deeply to those specific needs of those particular populations. And Leanne is stating that the difficult to reach were some who were disengaged already, which is very true. And that's great that you had luck with the migrant and ELs, because you did have that relationship, which I'm glad you brought that up. We'll be talking about that in a minute. All right, so let's talk about what was amplified by the pandemic. Well, as we know, lower attendance rates, right? We struggled to get kids to actually show up on the screen. Access was an issue, so technology access, connectivity, which is a whole nother thing that you know, needs to be really carefully looked at and remedied. Food, everybody was participating in food distribution, other basic needs, reading materials. So how are we getting those into the hands of the students? And then access to people, actually, you know, people to talk to. That separation and isolation was really, was and is really a big important piece that needs to be addressed. Failing grades, I can speak to that from experience. My daughter is a middle schooler. I keep saying I think 7th grade was probably a really good year to sort of be home, because it is such an interesting time. She was able to transition into 6th grade, you know, in person. 7th grade, I don't know. They all left as kids and now they're going back as 8th graders. I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot to navigate this next year altogether. But she did experience some of this as well. And I think those failing grades happen for so many reasons, because there may be just misunderstanding of the expectations, or waiting to the last minute. I can speak for her case in particular, not able to get all the assignments in. And so if grades are based on traditional systems, then yes, there will be a lot of failing grades. Students' mental well-being, of course, there was trauma introduced for everybody, including our students, but that is something that needs to be acknowledged and recognized and is being addressed with a lot of the social emotional learning components that people are incorporating into their learning now. And that decrease in student engagement in virtual learning. So maybe they did show up, but they just weren't engaged. More and more the screens were off. Questions would be asked, or the meeting would end early, or the class would end early, and those black boxes were still there. So it was clear that there wasn't a whole deep engagement from everybody all the time. And then those differing home needs, you know, caring for siblings, you know, needing to contribute money because times were tough, especially for some of our families that weren't able to benefit from some of the government offerings. And so that has been a big, important thing to acknowledge, that all of those were amplified. There may have been childcare issues before, there may have been poverty issues before, it just was amplified by the pandemic. Okay. And so how have we adjusted our approach? So thinking about what will we take with us into the new school year? So again, in the chat, I want you to think about some things that you have already done or already thought about to adjust your approach to reaching all students. What are some of the things from the pandemic that will help us to bridge and create new learning opportunities for students as we re-engage? We want to define the problem and then look at ways that we can ideate. And those of you who joined late, welcome. We're happy to have you here today. We're talking about innovations, for some forced innovations due to the last couple of years, but also some ways that we're reimagining learning for our different student populations as we re-engage. I know some of you have started school already. We're here in Portland, we're starting in a week. There's been some schools that are starting and stopping because of continued challenges with health, but we need to be thinking about ways that we're going to continue some of the things that have worked over the last 18 months. Yes, Beverly. So some of that more focused attention to technology. And I think that's one of the greatest pieces that have come out of this, is thinking about how we as adults have engaged it with one another, but also provided that for students, because so often, you can be, not feeling well at home, or, having to care for a sibling, but you can still engage in ways that we weren't ever able to do in the past due to that technology. I think it's highlighted a lot of our issues when you talk about access, to food and to quality food. And so thinking about how we're providing that as well. Okay, I will keep going, but please feel free to continue to add your thoughts and your ideas to the chat when you have an opportunity. Okay, Leanne is saying we have one-to-one devices now, grades 7 through 12, and soon to lower grades. That's great, and that additional connectivity is important. And then a learning management system. Yes, so that training is to be continued and have more consistent means of communicating to parents. And then that is another really powerful piece I think that has come out of this as well, is that ability to really connect with parents in new ways. And, you know, whether it's through applications or through, you know, texting, doesn't necessarily have to be a phone call like we've done in the past, or opportunities to connect over Zoom. Everybody has, you know, pretty much everybody has a smartphone. And so thinking about ways that you were able to connect with your families and continuing those as well is important. And I also think it's important to mention that, you know, seeing parents, having parents see themselves as teachers, and then also seeing parents as teachers. We really had to rely on families to provide a lot of that support, which we hadn't done in the past as much. So really giving them confidence and skills, and knowing that maybe we need to provide more support for that as well in the future. So what is it that we have learned? Well, that relationships matter, that family matters, and that school matters. You know, I think about what would have happened to our students if they didn't have school. They did need to connect. We do need to provide them opportunities for them to connect even more. You know, we are social beings, and it's really hard to do that on a flat screen. And so just really focused on what's important. You know, we've had some major issues and challenges that we faced as a society. So really focusing on those relationships and family and school. And you're already doing some of those innovations because we were forced to, but let's be really intentional about what we do moving forward, and how can we enhance and best leverage the skills that the students are bringing and build on their assets. So we need to make those adjustments to our approaches, right? So one of the things mentioned was combating those lower attendance rates. Well, maybe we need to keep some flexibility in the structure, in the school structure. So whether, you know, it's attending, sometimes maybe you can attend attend either virtually or have more asynchronous work, but just being really flexible so that students can engage based on their needs. Having some of those whole student supports, those wraparound supports, could help engage students better. I know one of the innovations that a school district was doing this summer was providing childcare in the school itself. Now that's not necessarily something they could do year round, or maybe it is, but you know, in order for the kids to come, high schoolers to come engage in summer school, they were in charge of their siblings. They were able to engage them in some sort of childcare situation so that they could come. Thinking about incentivizing or being creative in ways to engage students. So building relationship is hard on a flat screen. If we're having opportunities to be together, how is it that we're ensuring that kids are coming to school? Well, we know that relationship is critical. Relationship is the best way. So how are you being creative in building relationship with your students, whether they're in person or virtual? And then thinking about getting physical. So if we get through this, we're going to go outside and we're going to try this, or we're going to play this game, you know, so different kinds of movement and activity and things. I think about my daughter who engaged in soccer midway through this pandemic, and how getting physical really changed her whole outlook on things. So trying to incorporate that is really important as well. And so thinking about adjusting our approaches for failing grades, and this is a big one. And I think this is something that, you know, we can all take a really closer look at, and maybe through a new lens. But thinking about grading for equity. So instead of having, you know, the idea that you have to master a subject and you'll be based on that, spend time on a subject and it'll be based on the amount of time, but you're assessing whether or not the child is mastering the subject, the student is mastering the subject. So lots of opportunities for different ways of learning the content, including, some of it on their own, and then just demonstrating mastery rather than they have to attend every day, and that if they don't attend, that's going to affect their grade. Having that single measurement system for advancement toward mastery of academic standards is not working. There has to be multiple ways for students to show proficiency and for students to show that they can actually reach those academic standards. And I think that there's a lot of ways that people have been able to do that over the, that people have been exploring. So we can all learn from one another there. And then, with like I've said earlier, those assignments taught and assessed both remotely and in person. It doesn't have to be the way that we've always done it or the way that we grew up doing it. It doesn't have to be that traditional way. And lending that individual attention is so much more important now than it ever was. Finding out different ways to do that, having a one-on-one even if we're in person, but having let's get together this afternoon when you get home and let's talk about this over Zoom, so that you don't have to stay after school and miss your bus for me to be able to help you. So thinking about different ways that we might provide those kinds of supports. And then a big one is these grading scale allowances. So thinking about different ways to grade. So maybe it's, the 1 through 4 or numerical scale to 100, but trying to figure out ways that we can adjust our grading instead of using that traditional A to F system. A big one, which I think is something that is almost the most critical, is allow for revision and reassessment. So allowing students time to reflect if they didn't do so well on an assignment or on a learning, giving them the supports they need and giving them another opportunity to show what they know and are able to do. Instead of giving Fs, use incompletes. That just shows that they didn't quite complete what they needed to do, but they can go back and finish it up. That's a critical piece as students are learning. You just to have to start all over again. We know that we've got credit recovery programs, that we've got students that are lacking, even in a district that we're working in, even if they miss 1 or 2 courses, then they're off track for graduation. And so how can we retain what they have done and just fill in the gaps so that they can go back and continue their coursework for graduation? And again, allowing students multiple options for demonstrating their knowledge. And I'm going to put in the chat this link, and let me know if it doesn't work. But this is where a lot of this information has come from. Okay, so the idea about equity in those grading systems. I hate to read this out loud to you, but since we're not in person, I think I will have to. Traditional grading systems can disproportionately punish students who have fewer supports and create advantages for students who have more stable and supportive home environments. Eliminating grading for activities such as homework competition and participation can help remove bias in assessing student performance. So again, very critical. Those, when we attach attendance to grading, it's not assessing what the students know. It does not assess what they're able to do, right? Homework isn't necessarily available, those structures and supports for all students when they get home. And so how can we offer supports in different ways? Can we utilize the technology that we have available to all kids now to create, supportive graphic structures, Google Docs, other kinds of things that kids can fill in or share their ideas in a smaller way that doesn't necessarily create a lot of stress and pressure, and therefore kids don't want to tackle it. So just trying to think about different ways to bring equity back into homework and into grading. So again, looking at adjusting our approaches, students' mental well-being. Well, we need lots of opportunities for that social emotional learning, right? How are we engaging kids socially? How are we engaging kids emotionally? How are we engaging kids building relationships with the adults that are around them and with their peers? Opportunities to connect in new ways. One of the examples I can bring forward is my daughter was participating in an after-school program before the pandemic, and there was a program called Betty's 360, and I think it's local, but I'm sure that there's a lot of those kinds of programs around, and it was for middle school girls and trying to keep them engaged and giving them social opportunities and skills and all of that with one another through adventures. And so during the pandemic, that continued. They weren't meeting after school in person anymore, but they met weekly over Zoom, and the instructor would drop off a tie-dye kit at the front door. And then the kids would tie-dye their own t-shirts, and then their next meeting, everybody would be wearing their t-shirts on the Zoom. And so just thinking about other ways to keep kids engaged, connecting, being creative, that will help with their social emotional well-being. And again, that movement and outdoors, we were able to do a couple of activities like hiking with this group with families involved. So you get 2 bangs for your buck, right? So you're out there getting outside, and you're being social and involving the community as well. And then access approach. So technology and connectivity, we've talked about that one already. We all are very familiar, but again, providing those hotspots and things for internet. I know in the beginning of the pandemic, that was a really big deal. I think that maybe we're moving towards that as a society, that there's got to be connectivity opportunities for everybody. The food and other basic needs, access to that. Books, art supplies, those kinds of materials. I know my daughter's art teacher had bags of stuff ready to go so that people could come and pick it up. Well, at school, we should be supplying those as well. If they're in person, why not send a bag of art supplies home with everybody for the semester, right? They can continue doing that at home, making that connection, that bridge between home and school that much more clear, so that it's not, art isn't something you just do at school, right? They can continue things at home as well. And then like involving community organizations, access to those. I know that summer programs filled up really quickly, and it wasn't from the kids who most needed access to those. And so how are schools really being intentional with getting community organizations available so that their students are able to, that most needed, are able to engage in swim lessons or camps or after school programming, not just for the parents that are on top of it. All right, so again, decreased student engagement in that virtual learning. Well, that was rough, right? So how are we remedying that? Well, relationship building was really important. And I think the teachers that were most successful at that were the ones that really worked hard, where they'd have, spirit days where they'd bring, ask kids to wear, a hat that day, or to wear costumes, or, to dress up as book characters, or other ways to engage. Also allowing, students to eat when they wanted to eat, so that there weren't, sometimes it's hard to do when you're on Zoom all day. How do you fit in your meals? And not everybody is hungry at the same time. So really being flexible with that as well. Making peer projects part of your curriculum. I know in your daily routine, I know that for my daughter, the opportunities that she had to work with others, and choice within that even sometimes, really engaged her, particularly for those kids that are tough to engage. And then opportunities to connect that are non-academic, like we talked about. I know that there was an equity group that one of the teachers started, and so different kinds of clubs that were starting up that could continue to be virtual. They don't have to be in person as we look toward the fall. So just thinking about ways that are non-academic that might build on students' strengths and interests. And then addressing those competing needs at home. So those childcare offerings at school that I talked about earlier, offering paid internships. I know some summer school programs were doing that as well, trying to figure out ways that they could involve community organizations that would support tutoring for students, so that older students could tutor younger students and get paid for it. How are we engaging and supporting families with their particular needs? Because all families have diverse needs. It's not just the traditional, well, people are working. Well, there's a lot of other needs at home too. So how can we, support families as their schedules are changing, or how can we get kids to start to begin to make some meals, or how are other ways that we could help families to engage with schools, with their kids, and also to support those families as they're trying to do it all. Okay, so we have some more opportunities for innovation and learning. That extended day program that we talked about earlier. So before and after school, really providing lots of opportunities, whether you're adjusting schedules for certain staff or you're inviting community to come in and provide those supports. Or summertime learning, are there mini camps? A lot of teachers, students, everybody didn't want to engage in 6 to 8 week long programs over the summer. We could look at our after school programs like that as well. Could they do, week long camps? So this week it's going to be robotics, and next week it's going to be something, some art, so that kids can sign up for things a week at a time. To engage in different ways of learning and things that really spark their interest and broaden their skills and their interests as well. Those bridge camps have been really important. So, what turned into might be a 5th to 6th grade camp in our region turned into a 5th and 6th to 6th and 7th grade camp, right? Because we never really got opportunities for those 6th graders to make that bridge between elementary and middle school when we were forced to close. So really giving those camp ideas a thought to try to bring in different ways of engaging kids. And then the tutoring and mentoring programs. I think that this is one of the, and especially in the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying that the best way we're going to be able to meet these individual needs is through tutoring. Well, that's true, but we have so many students that are going to need those need those particular services. And so how are we engaging in mentoring programs as well, so that kids can begin to help other kids, and maybe they can get credit for it, or do some sort of credit recovery program for supporting the younger students. So one of the things that we have really tried to emphasize and see a big spark in throughout our region is this idea about place-based education, which is also, another term for project-based learning. So it's designed to connect what students are taught in school to real-world challenges, opportunities, and connections. Those learning experiences match the complexities of real life and are taught through an integrated, interdisciplinary, and frequently project-based approach, where all learners are accountable and challenged. So one of the things that Education Northwest did this past summer was create a series of lessons for based on 2 different units. One was social justice and one was STEM, through project-based learning, where students had choice. They had the opportunity to do some research, to define a problem, to create solutions, and come up with a ending project. And the integrated interdisciplinary approach is really an important one now, because when we do our subjects that are standalone, a lot of times students are having a hard time seeing the connections between their other students. So if we can embed math in social studies and in science learning, then it really does help students to broaden their abilities there. And I think for single, a lot of times with single teachers, if you're a 7th through 12th grade science teacher, it's a little bit harder to do this because you don't have anyone maybe in your school to plan with, but you can start with one lesson, one unit. You can connect with teachers across the district to make sure that, you do have the support that you need so that you can try some of these innovative practices. But we did find that a lot of schools are really interested in this project-based learning or place-based education. And so in some, we're really needing to design programs responding to those individual student needs. And thinking about that graphic we had at the beginning, trying to determine what those student needs are, well, we're used to making assumptions. And so how are we digging in with families? I know a lot of districts were really good at that in the beginning. As you were trying to design your district plans, you really wanted feedback from families because you can't design something and then have nobody come. And so can we continue that? Well, we sure can. So continuing to engage families, ask families, call families, listen to families on what it is that their particular needs are. So offering those options and choices to students is critical, incorporating the social emotional learning, making sure that the things that you are offering have some cultural relevance and interest, supplying those food and drink and basic needs for students in general for the home, but also throughout the school day. How are students able to, like, oh, I'm thirsty, instead of thinking about how thirsty they are for the whole entire math lesson, allowing them to get the water that they need or to bring what they need into the classroom. Sometimes that's easier said than done. I know there's critters and all kinds of other things you need to think about. And then really importantly, fostering agency and that student voice in all of what you do. So continuing that to ease that pressure with flexible due dates. Collaborative projects like we talked about earlier with peer learning or learning with friends and making it fun and engaging. I know that the principals with whom we worked with over the summer were saying, all I want is for kids to come, for kids to see people, to not necessarily touch, we don't touch, but to be with people and to eat some good food and then come back the next day. Like, we just want them to have fun and be happy and to continue coming back and staying engaged in something, right? We don't know what kids were doing. We can make a lot of guesses, but we really want them to stay engaged in healthy ways by coming back to school. So revisiting that interaction, the design foundation, so that design thinking, empathize with your learners, define your learners' needs, their problem and your insights, ideate by challenging assumptions and creating ideas for those innovative solutions, developing prototypes to start creating those solutions and then testing those solutions and then starting it all over again. It's really important to think about that in education. They've been using it in business for a long time, but how are we able to leverage this for our needs as well? And I'm going to put this into the chat so you have access to a little more information about this as well. So what is happening in Idaho schools? And I would love to give you an opportunity to share that. We had talked about doing breakout rooms, and I'm happy to put you in breakout rooms, or if people would just share openly here, we have a small enough group. I would sure love to know what your thinking is. What are some of the ideas that you have for Idaho schools for this next school year? Does anybody want to be brave and share an idea? Are there opportunities to make adjustments to the schedule, for example? Or is anybody engaging in some grading practices, modifications and adjustments? What are some of the approaches that you're taking? And you can put them in the chat. I won't make you talk. Okay, John, thank you for being brave. You're starting walk to read interventions. Great. So you're giving kids opportunities to learn, and I'm going to make some assumptions here, and temporary learning groups strategically based on their specific need at the time, right? And so I'm going to make an assumption that those can be flexible groups, and so they'll be walking to read until, yes, he says yes, until they learn that particular skill, and then they can move to different areas. So that takes a lot of coordination, but it's another way that we can differentiate and really try to address individual needs. I think right now reading instruction was going to be all over the board as we see kids come back. So Karen says that there's a staff member that shared the check and connect process, which includes interventions to enhance student engagement and keep them on path to graduation. That sounds fascinating. That's great. So I'm assuming that's for high school, but check and connect, which is really a great idea to keep kids engaged with school. Adding a 0 hour before the regular school day for assistance with math skills. I wish that was happening for my child. That's a great idea. I think, our basic skills, our reading and math skills have suffered for sure this past year. So offering opportunities for before and after school supports for that. Tutoring, like I said earlier, is hard to do, but if you have walk to read or walk to math or walk to different activities that help to support the skill development as well as before and after school support, that's great. Karen says actually all the grades check and connect. That's great. So yeah, you're on the path to graduation from the very beginning, right? Wonderful. Well, I appreciate everybody's engagement today. Thank you so much for all you do for your students. And I wish you well. I would love to hear about the things that you're doing that you're having success with, and even the things that you're having challenges with. I would love to be a thought partner if you're struggling with something and wanted some additional ideas or supports on how you might make some adjustments to address it. A couple more things that came into our chat is the school started advisory daily for the first 15 minutes of the day, and they use Character Strong, which is another program that's really supportive for students. The middle school principal wants to try accelerated reading, or called My On, but make it fun with prizes. I know we're trying not to do that extrinsic motivation, but I think anything that we can do now to try to involve kids is good to go, right? It's on the table. Leisure free or choice reading, by the Wilhelm and Smith research, absolutely, and then the social emotional learning, good. Well, I wish you all lots of luck. I'll stay on and be here for any questions or any conversation that you want to continue to have today. But thanks again for your engagement and for joining us today. Good luck with everything.